They buried Thomas Blackwell on a cold Tuesday in October, his casket sealed shut because the fire had burned too hot to leave anything recognizable. His wife Sarah wept beautifully in black Chanel. His cousin Raymond delivered a eulogy about family bonds. His lawyer Dale managed the estate with practiced solemnity. They thought they'd gotten away with murder. They were wrong. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy stories of justice, revenge, and mountain wisdom, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Today's story is about a man who came back from the grave to destroy those who betrayed him. Let's dive in. 6 months later, a drifter in worn overalls and a scraggly beard stood at the edge of what used to be his land, watching the morning mist hang thick over Copper Hollow like a shroud. Thomas Blackwell, very much alive, stood there dressed in clothes he'd bought from a thrift store in Knoxville, worn denim overalls, a faded flannel shirt with patches at the elbows, and boots that had seen better days. His silver hair, once meticulously groomed, now hung long and unkempt beneath a stained baseball cap. A scraggly beard covered his face, hiding the sharp jawline that had once graced the covers of business magazines. He looked every bit the part of a drifter, a man down on his luck, seeking work in the mountains. No one would recognize Thomas Blackwell, the coal baron who'd supposedly died in a car accident 6 months ago. That man was dead in every way that mattered. What stood here now was someone else entirely. Someone with a singular purpose. The Blackwell Mining Company had been in his family for 4 generations, built on the sweat and determination of mountain people who knew these hills like the backs of their hands. Thomas had grown up in these hollows, played in these creeks, and learned the business from his father, who'd learned it from his father before him. Unlike the big corporations that had swept through Appalachia like locusts, the Blackwells had always taken care of their own. Fair wages, safe working conditions, health care for the miners and their families. These weren't just policies, they were promises. But promises, Thomas had learned, meant nothing to some people. His cousin, Raymond Blackwell, had been his right hand, his trusted partner, the man he had helped put through college when Raymond's father drank himself to death. His lawyer, Dale Hutchins, had handled every contract, every deed, every legal matter for 20 years. And Sarah, Sarah, his wife of 15 years, the woman he'd built his life around, the woman who'd stood beside him at charity galas and whispered that she loved him every night before sleep. They'd all betrayed him. The plan had been elegant in its cruelty. Sarah had been having an affair with Raymond for 3 years. Thomas had the private investigator's photos to prove it, though he'd discovered them too late. Together with Dale, they'd systematically embezzled millions from the company, cooking the books, creating shell corporations, and funneling money into offshore accounts. When Thomas had started to suspect, when he'd begun asking questions, they'd decided to eliminate the problem permanently. The car accident had been meticulously planned. Raymond had suggested the late-night drive to inspect the new site up on Black Mountain. Dale had arranged for the mechanic, a man deep in gambling debt, to tamper with the brakes. Sarah had kissed him goodbye that evening, her eyes dry, her smile practiced. But Thomas Blackwell hadn't died. The car had gone over the edge, yes, tumbling down the mountainside in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. but he'd been thrown clear 20 feet before the vehicle hit the bottom and exploded into flames. He'd crawled through the woods with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs, delirious with pain, until he'd stumbled onto old Ezra Grant's property. Ezra was a hermit, a man who'd lived in the mountains for 83 years and trusted the law about as far as he could throw a bear. When Thomas had gasped out his story between bloody coughs, Ezra had simply nodded, set his bones with hands that remembered folk medicine, and asked one question. "You aiming to set things right?" Thomas had nodded. "Then you stay dead," Ezra had said. "Dead men can move freely. Living ones got too many eyes on 'em." For 3 months, Thomas had healed in Ezra's cabin, reading the newspapers that reported his death, watching the funeral on Ezra's ancient television. Sarah had worn black Chanel and cried beautifully for the cameras. Raymond had given a eulogy about the bonds of family. Dale had managed the estate with solemn efficiency. The company had been sold within 8 weeks, sold to a corporation that immediately began cutting corners, laying off workers, and stripping the land without regard for the people or the environment. Everything Thomas had built, everything his family had stood for, dismantled in the pursuit of profit. The workers had fought back, of course. His miners were mountain people, stubborn and proud, but without jobs, without savings, with families to feed, they'd eventually scattered. Some to other states, some to other industries, some simply to despair. Thomas had watched it all from the shadows, planning, preparing, and waiting. Now he was back. The Copper Hollow diner hadn't changed much. The same yellow Formica tables, the same cracked vinyl seats, the same smell of coffee and bacon grease. Thomas pushed through the door, and the bell chimed overhead. A few heads turned, assessed him as a stranger, then returned to their plates. In the mountains, strangers weren't uncommon. Drifters, hikers, the occasional tourist lost on the back roads. Martha Henderson was still behind the counter, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She was heavier than Thomas remembered, the lines around her eyes deeper. Her husband, Jack, had worked in the mines for 32 years before the closure forced him into retirement. Thomas knew they'd lost their house last month. "Coffee?" Martha asked, her voice professionally neutral. "Please, ma'am. And maybe some eggs if it's not too much trouble." She poured the coffee without comment, then called the order back to the kitchen. Thomas sat at the counter, letting the conversation around him wash over. Heard Raymond's building himself a new house up on Sunset Ridge. Got himself a view that'll cost near about $2 million. Dale Hutchins came by the church last week with a check, acting like he's some kind of saint. Clara Patterson told him what he could do with his guilt money. Sarah Blackwell's living down in Charleston now, spending money like water. My cousin saw her at some fancy restaurant, diamonds on every finger. Thomas's hand tightened on his coffee cup, but his face remained impassive. An old man at the end of the counter, Bobby Coombs, Thomas recognized him, a former crew chief, spoke up. "Any of you remember when old Thomas Blackwell ran things? My boy got leukemia when he was 7. Company insurance covered everything, and Thomas himself came to the hospital, sat with us, said family takes care of family." He shook his head. "These new owners, they don't even know our names." "Thomas was a good man," Martha said quietly, setting the eggs in front of Thomas. The stranger Thomas. "His daddy before him too," Mountain folk, even if they had money, knew what it meant to work for a living. Shame what happened, another voice added. Car accident, they said. But I always wondered. Don't talk foolish, Martha cut him off, but her eyes said she'd wondered too. Thomas ate slowly, listening, learning. The picture was clear. Raymond had set himself up as the new king of Copper Hollow, building a mansion with blood money. Dale had positioned himself as a civic leader, making strategic donations to ease his conscience or improve his reputation. And Sarah had simply fled, taking her share and leaving the ruins behind. They thought they'd gotten away with it. They thought Thomas Blackwell was dead and buried, his body burned beyond recognition in that wreck. They were wrong. Thomas found work easily enough. A man calling himself Tom Black, willing to work hard for minimum wage, wasn't uncommon in these parts. He hired on with a landscaping crew that, ironically, had gotten the contract for Raymond's new property. The house was obscene, perched on the ridge like a glass and steel monument to greed. It sprawled across 3 acres, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the valley where miners' families had lived for generations, the valley where people now struggled to pay for heating oil and groceries. Thomas worked the grounds, planting trees and laying stone, keeping his head down and his eyes open. Raymond visited the site twice a week, usually in a black Mercedes that cost more than most people in Copper Hollow made in 5 years. He'd grown fat on his theft, his face fleshy and red, his belly straining against expensive shirts. He barely glanced at the workers, treating them like animate tools. But one afternoon, Raymond's phone conversation drifted across the lawn where Thomas was setting flagstones. Dale's getting nervous. Says there are questions about some of the transfers. No, it's fine. The paper trail's buried deep. And even if someone found something, who'd care? Thomas is dead. The company's sold. Case closed. Yes, I know. Sarah's been spending too freely, drawing attention. I'll talk to her. You worry too much, darling. We won. It's done. Thomas's hands stilled on the stone. Darling. Raymond wasn't talking to Dale. There was someone else involved, someone he hadn't known about. That evening, Thomas followed Raymond's Mercedes down the mountain. The car stopped at a small cottage on the edge of Copper Hollow, a place Thomas recognized. It had belonged to his secretary, Jennifer Marsh, a single mother who'd worked for him for 5 years. Her car was in the driveway now, a new model, too expensive for a woman who should have been unemployed. The pieces clicked into place. Jennifer had access to everything, his schedule, his files, his plans. She'd been the one to suggest the late-night inspection that had nearly killed him. She'd been part of it from the beginning. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected. Jennifer's daughter had needed surgery 2 years ago. Thomas had quietly covered the costs, never mentioning it, never asking for repayment. He thought of Jennifer as family. Family. The word tasted like ash. Thomas spent the next 2 weeks gathering evidence with the methodical patience of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. Ezra had taught him to move through the mountains like a ghost, and Thomas put those skills to use. He installed cameras, tapped phone lines. Illegal, yes, but he was a dead man, and dead men didn't worry about warrants. The evidence piled up. Audio recordings of Raymond and Jennifer discussing the embezzlement. Dale's files, lifted from his home office during a late-night visit, showing the shell corporations and fraudulent transfers. Bank statements proving Sarah had known about the affair and the theft for months before Thomas's accident. But evidence wasn't enough. Thomas didn't want them arrested. Prison was too clean, too quick. He wanted them to lose everything the way he had. He wanted them to feel the walls close in, to watch their lives crumble, to know that their betrayal had consequences. He wanted them to suffer. The plan took shape slowly, carefully. Thomas had spent 30 years in business, navigating the complexities of contracts, partnerships, and corporate warfare. He knew that the most devastating attacks weren't physical. They were financial, social, and legal, a three-pronged assault that left nothing standing. First, he needed allies. Marcus Webb ran a small law firm in Knoxville, specializing in corporate fraud. He was young, hungry, and idealistic, the kind of lawyer who'd taken on mining companies pro bono and won. Thomas had followed his career with interest even before the accident. He called from a burner phone, disguising his voice. "Mr. Webb, I have information about fraud related to the Blackwell Mining Company sale. Are you interested?" The meeting was held in a parking garage, appropriately cinematic. Marcus arrived alone, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Thomas, still in his drifter disguise, handed over a manila folder containing copies of the documents he'd stolen. Marcus flipped through them, his expression growing darker with each page. "Jesus Christ, this is massive fraud, embezzlement, corporate theft, conspiracy. Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is bringing them down." "Who are you?" "Someone who was betrayed. Someone they thought was dead." Thomas let the words hang in the air. "Can you use this?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If this is authentic and I'll need to verify it, yes, I can use this, but I need to know your stake in this." "My stake is justice. File the charges, freeze their assets, make them bleed, and when it goes to trial, I'll be your star witness. You'll need protection if they tried to kill you once. I can take care of myself. Just do your job." Marcus tucked the folder into his briefcase. "This is going to be big. National news big. Are you prepared for that?" Thomas smiled for the first time in months. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm counting on it." The second phase required a more delicate touch. Thomas needed to turn the people of Copper Hollow against the conspirators, to ensure that even if they somehow escaped legal consequences, they'd be pariahs in their own community. He started small. Anonymous letters to local newspapers detailing Raymond's lavish spending while former miners went hungry. Leaked emails showing Dale's contempt for the mountain trash he pretended to help. Photos of Sarah's Charleston mansion posted on social media with captions about blood money. But the real work happened face to face. As Tom Black, the quiet drifter, Thomas spent evenings at the diner, the bar, the general store. He listened to people's stories, asked gentle questions, and occasionally dropped comments that made people think. Funny thing, isn't it? How the company got sold so quick after Thomas Blackwell died. You ever wonder who really benefits from that sale? Follow the money, my granddad used to say. Raymond sure seems to be doing well for someone whose cousin just died. Grief affects people differently, I suppose. The seeds sprouted. People started talking, questioning, connecting dots they'd previously dismissed. The local newspaper starved for Real Stories began investigating. The Charleston reporter who'd covered the funeral started making calls. And then Marcus Webb filed the charges. The news broke on a Thursday morning. Federal fraud charges against Raymond Blackwell, Dale Hutchins, Jennifer Marsh, and Sarah Blackwell. Arrest warrants issued. Assets frozen pending investigation. Thomas watched it unfold from Ezra's cabin, the old man chuckling beside him. "They'll be running scared now," Ezra said. "Scared people make mistakes." He was right. By noon, Raymond had tried to flee to his property in the Caymans, only to be arrested at the airport. Dale had holed up in his office, frantically shredding documents until the FBI arrived with a warrant. Jennifer had turned herself in immediately, already negotiating a plea deal. And Sarah had called a press conference. Thomas watched her on television, her beautiful face composed, her designer suit impeccable. She stood at a podium in Charleston, microphones thrust toward her like accusatory fingers. "I am innocent of all charges," she said, her voice steady. "I was a devoted wife to Thomas Blackwell. I knew nothing of any fraud. I'm being scapegoated because of my gender and my relationship to the accused. I will fight these charges vigorously, and I will be vindicated." The lies flowed smoothly, practiced, almost believable. Thomas felt a cold rage settle in his chest. It was time. The trial was set for 3 months later. In that time, Thomas prepared his resurrection carefully. He couldn't simply appear. The shock might derail the prosecution, give the defense grounds for mistrial. He needed to do this right. He met with Marcus Webb in secret, finally revealing his full identity. Marcus had stared at him for a full minute, then whispered, "Holy shit." "I need to testify," Thomas said, "but it has to be done properly, legally." "This is insane. They tried to kill you. This is attempted murder on top of everything else." "I know. Add it to the charges." "Thomas, Mr. Blackwell, this is going to be the trial of the decade. Are you ready for that? The media circus, the attention." Thomas thought of his father, who'd built the company with calloused hands and honest sweat. He thought of the miners who'd lost their jobs, their homes, their hope. He thought of the mountain, scarred and bleeding from the new owner's careless extraction. I'm ready. The day Thomas Blackwell rose from the dead started like any other. The courtroom in Knoxville was packed, journalists from national outlets jockeying for position. Raymond, Dale, and Jennifer sat at the defense table, their lawyers arranged around them like a wall of expensive suits. Sarah sat separately, maintaining her claim of innocence. The prosecution had been methodical, building their case piece by piece. Financial records, email chains, testimony from forensic accountants. The evidence was damning, but the defense had fought hard, creating doubt, suggesting alternative explanations, painting their clients as victims of circumstance. Now it was the prosecution's turn for their final witness. Marcus Webb stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Thomas Blackwell to the stand." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, the thunder of reporters rushing for their phones. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but chaos reigned. At the defense table, Raymond had gone white as paper. Dale's mouth hung open in shock. Jennifer had started crying. And Sarah. Sarah's composure had finally cracked, her face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Thomas walked down the aisle, dressed now in a proper suit, his hair cut, his beard shaved. He looked like himself again, older, Harder, but unmistakably Thomas Blackwell, coal baron, mountain son, the man they tried to murder. He was sworn in, took his seat, and looked directly at the defense table. Mr. Blackwell, Marcus began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. You were reported dead 6 months ago. Please tell the court what happened. Thomas took a breath. Then he told his story. He spoke for 2 hours, detailing the betrayal, the embezzlement, the murder plot. He described the car going over the edge, the explosion, the long crawl through the woods. He explained his survival, his recovery, his decision to stay dead while he gathered evidence. Why? Marcus asked. Why not come forward immediately? Because I wanted justice, Thomas said simply. Real justice. If I'd appeared alive, they would have covered their tracks, hidden the evidence, blamed everything on confusion or misunderstanding. Dead, I could move freely. Dead, I could see the truth of what they'd done. The defense attorneys objected repeatedly, called for mistrials, argued that the testimony was prejudicial. The judge overruled them each time. This was too important, too extraordinary to derail on technicalities. When it came time for cross-examination, Raymond's lawyer stood. He was a sharp-faced man from Atlanta, paid a fortune to save Raymond's skin. Mr. Blackwell, isn't it true that you had a drinking problem? No. That you were becoming erratic, paranoid, difficult to work with? No. That your cousin Raymond was actually trying to save the company from your mismanagement? Thomas leaned forward. My cousin Raymond was stealing from me, sleeping with my wife, and tried to have me killed. Those are facts, counselor. Facts documented in emails, recordings, and financial transfers. You can spin whatever story you want, but the evidence doesn't lie. The lawyer tried several more angles, but Thomas had spent 30 years in boardrooms, facing down men who thought they could intimidate or outsmart him. He didn't break, didn't waver, didn't give an inch. When Sarah's lawyer stood for her cross-examination, Thomas felt his chest tighten. Mr. Blackwell, you claim my client was involved in this conspiracy, but isn't it possible she was simply an unhappy wife who made a mistake? An affair is a mistake, Thomas said quietly. Helping plan your husband's murder is a crime. You have no proof she knew about any murder plot. Thomas nodded to Marcus, who pulled out a document. This is an email from Sarah to Raymond, sent 3 days before my accident. It reads, "Make sure it's clean. No loose ends. I can't wait for this to be over." Your Honor, the full email chain is in evidence. Sarah's lawyer sat down heavily. Sarah herself had tears streaming down her face, but Thomas felt nothing. That woman wasn't his wife. His wife had died long before he went over that cliff. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Raymond collapsed, sobbing, begging for mercy. Dale simply stared at the table, his face gray. Jennifer, who'd already pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony, was led away to begin her sentence. And Sarah looked at Thomas one last time, her eyes asking a question he would never answer. The sentences were harsh. Raymond got 30 years for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. Dale got 25. Jennifer got 10 with the possibility of parole. Sarah got 15. None of them would spend their stolen money. None of them would enjoy their blood-bought luxury. The assets were seized, liquidated, distributed. Some to pay back defrauded investors, some to the workers who'd lost their jobs, some to Thomas himself, though he'd already decided what to do with it. 6 months after the trial, Thomas stood on the ridge above Copper Hollow, looking down at the valley he loved. Ezra stood beside him, leaning on his walking stick. "You did it," the old man said. "Got your revenge." "Justice," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there? You got what you wanted. They're suffering. You won." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Below, he could see the new buildings going up. A community center, a health clinic, new homes for miners who'd lost everything. The Blackwell Mining Company had been reconstituted as a co-op, owned by the workers themselves, with Thomas as an advisor, but not an owner. He'd put every penny of his recovered assets into rebuilding what had been destroyed. "I didn't win," Thomas said finally. "I survived. There's a difference." He thought about Sarah sometimes, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Thought about the woman he'd loved, wondered when she'd stopped loving him, if she ever truly had. Thought about Raymond, who'd been like a brother, and Dale, who'd been a friend. Thought about Jennifer, who he'd helped without asking for thanks. The betrayal still hurt. It probably always would. But the mountains endured. The people endured. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. "You staying?" Ezra asked. Thomas nodded. "This is home. Always has been. I'm not running anymore." "Good. Mountains need men like you. Real men. Not the kind that run." They stood together in silence, watching the sunset over Copper Hollow. The mist was rising again, filling the valley with white. But Thomas could see through it now, could see the future taking shape, built on truth instead of lies, on justice instead of greed. He'd come back from the dead to set things right. Now he'd live to see his mountains heal. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. Not their suffering, but his survival. Not their destruction, but his rebuilding. They'd tried to kill him, tried to erase everything he'd built, tried to steal not just his money, but his legacy. They'd failed. Thomas Blackwell was alive. His company was reborn. His people were recovering. And the mountains, the eternal, enduring mountains, stood witness to it all. Years later, they'd tell stories about it in the Copper Hollow Diner, about the rich man who'd come back from the grave to set things right, about the conspirators who thought they were smart enough to get away with murder, about justice served mountain style, slow, patient, and absolute. Martha Henderson, still behind the counter, still pouring coffee, would sometimes catch sight of Thomas through the window as he walked past. He looked older now, the weight of everything he'd been through carved into the lines of his face. But his eyes were clear, and his step was steady. "That's a good man," she'd say to whoever was listening. "Been through hell and back, but he never forgot where he came from. That's mountain folk for you. We take care of our own." And in the mountains of Appalachia, where the mist still rose every morning and the old ways still held sway, that was the highest praise anyone could give. Thomas Blackwell had gotten his revenge. But more than that, he'd gotten his life back. His real life, the one built on solid ground instead of the quicksand of wealth and pretense. He died on that mountain road, but the man who'd crawled out of the woods, who'd lived as Tom Black, the drifter, who'd brought justice to those who'd wronged him, that man was more alive than he'd ever been. The hollow had its reckoning, and in the end, the mountains always balanced the scales.